read or had to read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales at school. Anyone read it at school? Yeah? Show what generation you're from, because most of us who are younger didn't read any of that. It was kind of rap and all that kind of thing at school. Well, you remember Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the tales of a group of pilgrims who made their way from Southwark in London all the way down to Canterbury Cathedral and Thomas à Becket's shrine there. Now, their pilgrimage was really just an excuse for a holiday. And you see all these kind of dubious characters in the Canterbury Tales that Chaucer is kind of poking fun at these dubious pilgrims along the way. Well, how different it is here in these songs of ascent that we began looking at last Sunday. This series of psalms were amazing songs that pilgrims would be singing as they travelled all the way up to Jerusalem for the 3 annual festivals of Passover, First Fruits and Tabernacles. And these songs are amazing examples to us on how to relate to the Lord and who the Lord is. Because our journey as Christians is that of pilgrimage, isn't it? John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. We're people on a journey who haven't arrived at our destination. And it's a glorious destination, which isn't Jerusalem, as it was in these songs of ascent, to the presence of God there in the temple. It is heaven itself, the presence of God in heaven itself. So the best is yet to be. We've got a glorious future to come, but how do we keep going week by week until we get there? It's such an encouragement to see so many familiar faces when we come back to Christchurch Westbourne. Testimonies of the Lord keeping you going as pilgrims through very difficult situations of health and loss and changes in life situation, and you're still here. You're still pilgrims. You're still on the journey. And it's a wonderful encouragement to us every time we come back. Well, there's so much to learn in these psalms, but with 3 of them to look at this morning, we're just going to look at kind of one application for each of them, which I hope will be helpful. So I think Psalm 123 tells us to ask for God's mercy. Psalm 124 to see God's deliverance, and then Psalm 125 to trust in God's protection. So the first one we look at, Psalm 123, tells us to ask for God's mercy. Now, at our carol service in December, it was really exciting because a Japanese girl became a Christian. And when we had her over for a meal the following week, a curry, we had some fun with the children playing at being Japanese. And she was saying that when you greet one another, posture is very important. So if you're greeting someone equal to you, you just go like that. But if you're greeting someone who's a bit more important than you, you go like that. And if you're greeting someone who's extremely important, you can't see me, you do that. Posture is very important because of who you're relating to. Well, what should our posture be as we come before the one whose throne is in heaven? What should our posture be before God as pilgrims on this journey? Well, one of the surprises of this psalm in verse 2 is this. Our posture should be as the eyes of slaves looking to the hand of their master, and as the eyes of a maid looking to the hand of her mistress. Now, isn't that a bit of a surprise to us this morning? We, as New Testament people, know the glorious privilege of being made sons of God, an awesome family relationship that we have with God, and we can call him Father. Now, the people here didn't have that great superior revelation that we have today. But there's something to learn here, isn't there? That as we come before the living God, we're to be asking for mercy, as slave to master and as maid to mistress. Now, what's common to both of those relationships, slave to master, maid to mistress? Well, those are relationships of responsibilities and not rights, are they? So if you're a slave, you don't go to your slave master demanding this and that, getting all matey with them. No, there's a relationship of authority there, isn't there? You might beg for the privilege of having time off to see a sick family member. And if you're a maid relating to your mistress, now I switch off when Corin watches Downton Abbey, so this is an illustration I might have got slightly wrong, but if you're a maid in Downton Abbey and you're relating to the Dowager Duchess, is that right? Have I got that right? I'm all at sea with these illustrations. Well, of course, the posture, there's a superior person that you're relating to. You don't come with rights and privileges. You come with responsibilities, asking for mercy if you're sick, that you might not have to do this duty that day. Well, as we come before the Lord our God, we can't stand on our rights because we don't have any. We can't expect favours because we've done nothing to deserve favours. But we come instead asking for mercy. And it's very striking in this Psalm 123 that this is mercy in the face of suffering for being a pilgrim. Verse 4, we've endured much ridicule from the proud, much contempt from the arrogant. And what does the psalmist say? You owe me one. I've done all this for you. Now really, you owe me a favour, Lord. Give me No, it's not that, is it? It's, Lord, have mercy on us. Even with this suffering that I've gone through, have mercy on me, Lord. That is the natural posture of a pilgrim before the living God. Have mercy on me, O Lord. Not, Lord, I've worked hard for you. I ran that Crusaders class all those years ago. I gave money to the new hall. I come to church. Lord, you owe me one. No. Our posture is to be, Lord, have mercy on me. Do you remember the story that Jesus told of the Pharisee and the tax collector? To somebody who was confident of their own righteousness, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, which one did Jesus say was the right one? It was the tax collector, wasn't it? Jesus said, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified or in the right before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Mercy, even as New Testament people, is the right posture before the living God. So it's right that we should humble ourselves this morning, recognizing that that's what we really need, isn't it? We don't stand on our rights. We don't deserve merit from God. We beg for mercy. And as those who've humbled ourselves this morning, there is very good news. Because mercy is what the Lord delights to show. So Micah 7, I love Micah 7. Who is a God like you who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. You will again have compassion on us. You will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea. Mercy is the great delight of the Lord in what he shows to us as undeserving sinners. So there's fantastic news for all of us here, because all of us are sinners. All of us haven't been the pilgrims that we know we should have been. And what does the Lord delight to show us this morning? It's mercy. Now, if our children have been grumpy all day, fighting against each other and stroppy, and then they ask for an ice cream at the end of the day, usually it will be a no. What do you deserve? You don't deserve an ice cream. Or just occasionally it might be, oh, go on then. But the Lord is very different from me, thankfully. His delight is to show mercy, Micah 7. And these pilgrim people in Psalm 123 knew that. They knew that even if they didn't have rights, they were the equivalent of slaves and maids coming before master and mistress, the Lord was somebody who delighted to show mercy. And that's our posture before the Lord. And it's the most encouraging posture to have, because as we wait upon him, he does show us his mercy. Psalm 123. Ask for God's mercy. Psalm 124. See God's deliverance. And it tells us here that it's a a song of David, probably looking back to the times of early 2 Samuel and the Philistines raiding all the time. Now, David had already defeated Goliath, he'd seen victory, but how did he react to this victory? If the Lord had not been on our side, verse 1, let Israel say, if the Lord had not been on our side when men attacked us, when their anger flared against us, they would have swallowed us alive. Now, I've enjoyed reading fairly recently a book called The Hinge Factor, which deals with various kind of what-ifs in history. Don't know if you like thinking about history in that way. You know, what if William Conqueror didn't win the Battle of Hastings? Or what if the evacuation of Dunkirk wasn't so successful at the start of the Second World War? Or what if we didn't win at Waterloo? Well, what we're finding here in this Psalm 124 is a whole load of what ifs. What if the Lord had not been on our side? What would have happened then? Total failure. Even David is saying this. Somebody who the people of God at this time and us today might have looked up to as a great one, a great kind of leader in history, somebody who had awesome strength and power and past victories to see. But he looks back and says, well, if the Lord had not been on our side, utter disaster would have been ours. He didn't get all puffed up, David, by thinking about, my mighty muscles did this, that clever planning and experience that I gained through past battles. He didn't go on a speaking tour, offering lessons in leadership, or writing a book saying victory and how I won it. He sees that it was God's deliverance that caused them to have this victory. You remember Churchill's words? In war, resolution; in defeat, defiance; in victory, magnanimity. What does David say? In victory, humility. To have achieved a victory is a cause to be humbled afresh about the Lord bringing that deliverance to his people. Now, I hope we can all see, if we're Christians here today, the big deliverance at the cross. That we've been delivered from sin and death and hell through Jesus dying on the cross for our sins, so that we have this wonderful future as pilgrim people of heaven itself. And this is secure and safe for us. I hope we constantly focus again on that big deliverance that the Lord has already brought for us at the cross. But how good are we at seeing the smaller deliverances in our lives? Those incidences when things went better than expected, or things didn't go badly wrong. How do we interpret our own history this morning? Do we see that if the Lord had not been in it, it would have spelt disaster? Or do we see, actually, I just managed to pull it off there. Not bad, eh? How do we interpret our own history this morning? Perhaps you're successful in business, or you look back on a career which you're really proud of. Well, the Lord said to his people in Deuteronomy, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 17 and 18. The very ability to produce wealth, the very ability to succeed, is the Lord's work. It's his deliverance upon us to be able to do that. Perhaps we've got children who've grown up as Christians. How do you look back on that? Do you say, well, we obviously did the right thing? Or do you think if the Lord had not been on our side, we would have gone the way of everyone else? Our children would have fled the nest and walked away from the Lord. Perhaps there's some achievement personally and some good news with health that we've had recently. Do we understand that as if the Lord had not been on our side, things would have gone very badly? Or how about as we think about things as a church? A new hall, great. We are really going places as Christchurch Westbourne, sorted. Or do we think, well, if the Lord had not been on our side, it could have been a half-finished building project? Or we could have still been in that old hall that would occasionally have dead birds in it when I was there, and there'd be kind of mould on the wall, and as you went up those stairs to the flat, you weren't quite sure if they'd still be there when you came down. Well, do you think if the Lord had not been on our side, we wouldn't have a new hall? I love that phrase that dear old Eddie Peirce passes around, and it's doing the rounds in Canterbury now. I can see God's fingerprints all over it. Well, is that the way that we see our lives and our experience? God's fingerprints all over our lives in the here and now. His deliverances day by day. Now, some of you I know have had difficult issues with health, and things just don't seem to be getting better. They're going backwards rather than forwards. Somebody in our church who will be preaching back at Emmanuel Church, Canterbury this morning, has had MS for decades. He can't walk properly, and if he's well enough to preach this morning, he'll be lifted in his wheelchair up onto the stage to preach the sermon. This is something that he wrote to me in an email. Number one, yesterday at 11:43 I wrote, next outside input on the calendar is a session with a physiotherapist next Tuesday. It'd be great if it could be earlier. He was in considerable pain right through his back and wasn't getting any sleep for days. Number two, yesterday at 8 o'clock those words were brought to the attention of the Emmanuel Church Canterbury prayer meeting. Number three, today at 12:58 the physiotherapist rang, offering me an appointment for this evening! Number four, I call on the Lord in my distress, and he answers me. The way that he interpreted that early call from the physio was the Lord's deliverance. Is that the way that we see even our medical concerns? That actually that little bit of good news that we've got that appointment at last is the Lord's deliverance and his love towards us in these concerns. Coincidences are God incidences, aren't they? And can you see God's fingerprints all over your life? And I hope you can bring the God talk into your conversation with those who aren't Christians. Suppose you're having coffee with a friend and you've just had your appraisal at work. How easy it is to have good talk about the Lord on a Sunday, and then you get into the work situation, you filter out all those conversations about, you kind of rephrase things to make it palatable for people who aren't Christians. But instead, we're to keep the God talk going, aren't we? In those situations when we're mingling with unbelievers. So you're having a coffee with a friend, he says, how's your appraisal at work? Do we say, yeah, fine, did all right, I think? Or do we say, yeah, fine, God really helped me to stay calm? Well, that person who's not a Christian might think, God? What do you mean? That might spark a conversation down the line. And we're to be testifying like David here, the Lord is the one who delivers us in little things and in big things as well. So let's not filter God out of our conversations. Be real, and being real means talking of the reality of God's deliverance. So Psalm 123, ask for God's mercy. Psalm 124, see God's deliverance. And Psalm 125, trust in God's protection. And this is a wonderful picture, isn't it? And let's get into it. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. Now, I've never been to Jerusalem, but Mount Zion apparently is the largest of the hills in Jerusalem, standing 2,500 feet high, pretty hard to shake, where David built a palace. But there are also other mountains. The most famous one, the Mount of Olives, about 300 feet higher than the Temple Mount and over 100 feet higher than any part of the city. On the north side, the Mitzpah of Benjamin and Gibeon and Ramah and the ridge near Bethlehem in the distant east. So it's a city surrounded by mountains. And mountains are pretty hard to shake, aren't they? I mean, we've seen Mount Everest shaken a little bit, but they don't move. Mountains are very hard to shake. And this is a wonderful picture of the Lord's protection of us. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. Now, this is a bit of a silly illustration, but I think it lodges in our minds. So here is a little figure of a man or a woman. And so there we are, on our own. And the Lord is saying that he is like the mountains that surround Jerusalem. He says, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. So he's got his big arms around us, so to speak, and surrounds us with his presence and love and protection. And there are various situations, aren't there, when we feel alone and afraid. Perhaps we've got something coming up and we're going to have surgery. Well, when we're having surgery and we're lying there feeling terribly alone, no members, we've got no family or no members of the family can come and be with us, we feel pretty scared about what's coming up. Well, remember this amazing picture. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. You'll be surrounded not just by nurses and doctors and surgeons, but you'll be surrounded by the Lord as you have that surgery. What about that situation when you're in work and you really feel on your own at work, you're the only Christian there, and just the whole world and environment is just really hard to be a Christian? Well, it's lovely being at church on a Sunday. Monday morning comes. What are you going to do? Remember that as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. Or perhaps as you just go home from church, it feels like yesterday when you would be going home with a whole crowd of members of the family, maybe with our spouse when they were alive. But our experience of church now is we walk home and we go home alone. And we feel that loneliness desperately. Well, the Lord says, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. This is a constant in our lives, that he surrounds us all the way on our pilgrim journey until we finally see him face to face. And he welcomes us with open arms when heaven comes itself. This is wonderfully encouraging, isn't it? But we need to apply it, don't we? We were burgled a few months ago. After it happened, it took a while for me to get back into normal sleep patterns. When I heard a bump in the night, I'd kind of wake up and think, is the door locked? Is the security light working? What's that noise? And I'd have my mobile phone near my bed. Now, they're all good things to do, aren't they? But if only I'd looked at Psalm 125. And remember that as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. In whatever situation we're in, it's the Lord's surrounding and his protection which is what really counts. And with his protection, that's all we need. Other things might be useful, but they're not to be our ultimate trust or protection. It's the Lord himself. Well, there's lots here, isn't there? It's very, very rich, this little section of these songs of ascent, and plenty to encourage us on our pilgrim journey. But maybe take one thing from these three psalms. Is it Psalm 123 that we need to ask for God's mercy and make sure our posture is right before the Lord? Is it that we need to see God's deliverance and to read our own story and the story of this church and of Christians worldwide? If the Lord had not been on our side, we'd be nowhere. Or is it Psalm 125 that we need to trust in God's protection, that he is always with us as pilgrim people right up to the time that we see him joyfully face to face in heaven? Should we pray together? Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken but endures forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people both now and forevermore. Heavenly Father, we praise you for the wonderful confidences you give us in these psalms. We praise you above all that we are surrounded by you now, tomorrow, this week, with whatever we fear coming up in our lives, even death itself. We don't go through death alone, but you surround us with your presence and your love. And you want us to be with you, and we will, as we follow you as pilgrims. How we praise you for this wonderful future. We praise you that you love to show mercy to us. And we praise you for all the encouragements of what we see in these psalms. Help us all and all in this church to keep going as pilgrims, right until that day when we see you face to face. Amen. A long time ago, maybe the first book in English we would have learned, in addition to the Bible, would have been John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Past generations would have grown up seeing this wonderful story of a man going on a pilgrimage until he gets to his destination, the celestial city. And that's a wonderful description of what it's like to be a Christian. We haven't arrived at our destination. No matter what the world says to us about how we can have everything now, we can't. The destination is where we're looking forward to. And just like young children in the back of a car saying, "Are we there yet?" Well, the answer for all of us here is no, we're not. And we feel it so painfully so much of the time, don't we? And I must say the biggest encouragement of being here, back here at Christchurch Westbourne, is seeing so many of you who are still here, still coming and singing hymns. So many of you still believing the things of the gospel, still going as pilgrims, despite all the hardships that I hear about what's going on in your lives. What some of you have been through recently in past few years since being away is extraordinary. I don't know how you do it in keeping going. But the Lord has kept you going, and you're pilgrims on a journey with us all as believers, looking forward to this great destination that's to come. Now, we need help, don't we? We need bread from heaven to keep going. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, as we go through this barren land. And we need this bread, and we've got it here this morning. And we're in for a treat. There are 3 big bits of bread in these 3 psalms that we're going to look at this morning. And they give us great lessons in discipleship, in how to keep going on our journey. Psalm 123 tells us to ask for God's mercy. Psalm 124 tells us to see God's deliverance. And Psalm 125 tells us to trust in God's protection. So these songs of ascents were songs that pilgrim people in the Old Testament would have sung on the way to the 3 annual festivals in Jerusalem. Jerusalem being the place where God dwelt with his people in the temple. And as they went on the rugged road all the way up to Jerusalem for Passover, first fruits and tabernacles, they sang. And they sang these songs and reminded one another about the path of discipleship as pilgrims. And the first thing that we see is this, which is very striking in Psalm 123, is that we're to ask for God's mercy. Now, it's really exciting at our carol service in Emmanuel Church, Canterbury, in December. We had a Japanese girl who became a Christian afterwards, Sakari. And when we had her for a meal the following week, we were talking to her about different cultures and different greetings and things. And she was telling us that in Japanese culture, posture is very important. So if you're greeting someone who's an equal, you might go like this. If you're greeting someone who's a bit more important than you, you might go like this. If you're greeting someone who's really important, you go like this. And then you come up eventually. Posture is very important in some cultures. Well, what should our posture be as we come before the Lord whose throne is in heaven? Well, the striking thing as we lift up our eyes to him is verse 2, isn't it? Our posture is to be as the eyes of slaves looking to the hands of their master, as the eyes of a maid looking to the hand of her mistress. Now, that's a puzzle, isn't it? As New Testament people, we know that if we believe in Jesus, we become adopted as sons or children of God, and we can call God Father with all confidence. So why here do we have, verse 2, that we're to be like slaves before a master, or like a maid before her mistress? Well, what's common to both? Well, I think it's because those relationships are ones of responsibilities, not rights. If you're a slave, you don't go swaggering up to your slave master, demanding this and that, being all matey with them. There is a relationship of authority there, and if there was something that you needed, like a day off to see a sick relative, you'd be begging that your master would be merciful. This is not something you deserve from your master, but he might be merciful in granting it to you. I don't watch much Downton, but if you get into kind of Downton Abbey mode and you see the people below stairs, if they really wanted a holiday, well, they'd be asking mercifully for a holiday from their bosses, or the Dowager Duchess, or whatever she's called. I fall asleep when Corinne watches it, so I don't know anything about Downton. It's a relationship where you're begging for mercy, and that is to be the posture of pilgrims before their God. We can't stand on our rights ourselves, we don't have any. We can't expect favours in ourselves, we've done nothing to deserve favours. We come asking for mercy. And we can sometimes forget that, can't we? Lord, I've worked hard for you all these years. I ran a crusader class all those years ago. I gave money to the new hall. I come to church. You owe me one. Really? Our posture is always to be calling upon the Lord for mercy. That's the right posture. Jesus, in Luke chapter 18, told this story, you'll remember it. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you I'm not like the other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector was in a different place. He stood at a distance. He couldn't even look up to heaven, and this is what he said. He beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus said, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, rather than the other, went home justified or in the right before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Mercy is the posture we're to have before God. Well, this is humbling, isn't it? To see that we have no rights, that we're to come before the living God for mercy. But once we have humbled ourselves this morning and recognized this, there is great encouragement for us all. Because as it says in Micah chapter 7, the Lord delights to show mercy. Who is a God like you who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. So we can come without rights, not deserving any merit from God, but coming confidently expecting that he will show mercy to us as undeserving, half-hearted, unworthy pilgrims. And this is what's amazing about our God. Now, picture the scene. Our 4 children have been at each other the whole day, and they have the cheek at the end of the day to ask Daddy for an ice cream. I might just say, no, you don't deserve it. I might on another day say, oh, go on then. But God, in the way that he treats us, is totally different, thankfully. Unlike me, he delights to show mercy. It is his greatest delight to show mercy to unworthy sinners like us. And that's why in this psalm, they were waiting, verse 2. As the eyes of slaves look to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maid look to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God till he shows us his mercy. This is his characteristic, to show mercy even above judgment. This is amazing, isn't it? And it draws us to him magnetically. He's not saying, oh, where were you? Why didn't you do that? He delights to show mercy. And we ask him, have mercy on us, O Lord, have mercy on us. And even the psalmist here, having endured much contempt, ridicule from the proud, contempt from the arrogant, is not saying, I've done all this for you, I've suffered for you, you owe me one. It's mercy all the way, isn't it? No matter how active or inactive we've been, no matter how godly or ungodly, we come before the Lord for mercy. Having humbled ourselves that this is what we're to be asking, having been delighted by knowing that he is merciful, and if we wait for him to show us his mercy, he will. So is that your posture as you approach God this morning? Asking for mercy? Well, if it is, be encouraged. He will show you his mercy. So ask for God's mercy, Psalm 123. Psalm 124, see God's deliverance. Now, this title tells us that it's a song of David. And it may well look back to the time of early 2 Samuel and the Philistines kind of raiding all the time, tit-for-tat battles and skirmishes. Well, how did David, victorious David, react to these victories? Well, it's very striking, isn't it? If the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say, if the Lord had not been on our side when men attacked us, when their anger flared against us, they would have swallowed us alive. He reads the history of God's people at that time as a work of God's deliverance. In other words, David didn't get all puffed up by saying, look at my mighty muscles. I'm the one who can maul animals, and I'm a great shot with a thing. No, he doesn't say that. He says, if the Lord had not been on our side, we would have suffered total defeat, total loss, total failure. David didn't go on a speaking tour, offering lessons in leadership, or write a book, Victory and How I Won It. He sees God's deliverance at work, doesn't he? Remember Churchill's words? In war, resolution. In defeat, defiance. In victory, magnanimity. What about David? In victory, humility. Not even magnanimity. So how do we read the story of our lives this morning? I hope we can read it in terms of the big deliverance, if we're Christians here this morning, that Jesus died on the cross for your sins so that your sins are forgiven and you've been delivered from the kingdom of Satan and darkness and ultimate hell to be brought into his kingdom of light. He has delivered you. But are we good this morning, and this is a lesson I've needed to pay attention to in this psalm, of seeing the small deliverances? So there's the big deliverance of Jesus died on the cross for my sins, bringing me out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. But how do I read the history of my life now and in all those years that I've been a Christian? Do I see all the small deliverances that the Lord has brought about in my life? Perhaps you've had some success in your working life, or success in business even now. Well, why is it that you are successful? There are plenty of others as skilled as you, similar experiences to you, who weren't successful. You may say to yourself, this is the Lord in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 17 and 18, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. Success in our working lives is down to the Lord giving us that success. If the Lord had not been on my side, that deal or that career advancement or that job at all would not have been mine. Success is to humble us. Perhaps you've got children who've grown up as Christians. Well, perhaps you talk to your spouse, you pat yourself on the back, and how did we do that? When you see them happily playing with their grandchildren or whatever. How do we understand what's happened there? Do we recognize that If the Lord had not been on our side and theirs, the story would have been very different. Are we humbled by the fact that our children, or perhaps our grandchildren, are still going with the Lord? Do we have David's attitude of seeing God's deliverance? Got a new hall. Very exciting, wandering around the new hall. I remember the old one and the dead birds that would be found in the hall, and going up the steps of the flat and not being sure if the steps would still be there as you came down. The mould on all the walls and things like that. Well, it's lovely seeing this new hall. But do you understand the history of the new hall as God's deliverance? If the Lord had not been with you as a church, there would be no hall. There would be the old one. It might be a derelict site with harass fencing all around it. It might be a half-finished project. If the Lord had not been on your side, there would be no hall. I had the privilege of quoting Eddie Peirce at the last service without his permission, and he told me off for it. One of his phrases that I use a lot in Canterbury is, "You can see God's fingerprints all over that." That's a great Eddie Peirce phrase. Well, is that how we read what is going on in our lives? That God's fingerprints are all over this situation when something has gone well, when things haven't been as bad as they could be? Do you see God's fingerprints all over it? Sometimes we can ascribe some victory or deliverance to fate or luck or chance. But that's not the Christian way to react, is it? It's to see the deliverance of God and say, if he'd not been on our side, on my side then, the story would have been very different. As a member of our church in Canterbury who will be preaching about now, this morning, he's had MS for decades, and he'll be preaching from his wheelchair, having been lifted up on the stage in the hall. But he's always seeing, even through medical problems that don't go away, they only get worse, God's deliverance. And have a listen to this. He wrote to me by email. Yesterday at 11:43 I wrote, "Next outside input on the calendar is a session with a physiotherapist next Tuesday. It would be great if it could be earlier." He'd been through several days of having no sleep at all because of a really severe pain in his back. Then he goes on to say, "Yesterday at 8 o'clock in the evening, those words were brought to the attention of the Emmanuel Church Canterbury prayer meeting. We prayed about it." And then he says, "Today at 12:58, the physiotherapist rang offering me an appointment for this evening." And he quoted, "I call on the Lord in my distress, and he answers me." Is that the way that we read the phone call from the doctor? The results that have come in that have shown negative results? Is that the way that we read the fact that we've got a booking at all for that next appointment? Sometimes we can put God out of those areas of our lives, but it's constant deliverance, isn't it? Can you see God's care and deliverance over you, even through medical things and all situations in life? Coincidences are God incidences, and see God's fingerprints all over your life now. Let's not filter God out of our conversations as we leave church this morning. We go and scatter in our neighbourhoods and in our blocks of flats and workplaces. It's so easy, isn't it, to think, right, I'm with so-and-so now, they're not a Christian, so I'll just talk in a slightly different way to them. But how much better it would be if, when we talk to a friend at work and says, "Oh, how was your appraisal?" we don't say, "Oh, fine, I did all right, I think." Instead, we could say, "Fine, God really helped me to stay calm." We are ascribing that deliverance, that mini deliverance, to the Lord who brought it about. Or saying, well, if the Lord hadn't helped us, I don't think we'd have arrived on that rainy day as we went to see the grandchildren or so on. Ascribe to the Lord his deliverance. All these mini deliverances along the way are from him. And we're to recognize that, as David did in Psalm 124. Our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He is the one who made the heavens and the earth. He is the one who sustains the whole universe, and directs and bends every atom and molecule for the good of his people, as well as for his glory. And see his deliverance day by day. So Psalm 123 teaches us to ask for God's mercy. Psalm 124 teaches us to see God's deliverance. And Psalm 125 tells us to trust in God's protection. And I love the first couple of verses, which is just where we'll focus now. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken but endures forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. Now, I've never been to Jerusalem, but apparently there are lots of mountains around. There's Mount Zion, the largest of the hills in Jerusalem, standing 2,500 feet high, hard to shake, and where David built a palace. There are other mountains, the Mount of Olives, Temple Mount, Mitzpah of Benjamin, Gibeon, Ramah, all these mountains around. And these mountains offered protection from invaders. And that is the lovely picture of the way that the Lord protects us. As the mountains, which cannot be shaken but endure forever, surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people both now and forevermore. So this is a bit of a silly illustration, but suppose this little person here is you and me, little Lego figure, just in case if you haven't been to the optician recently, I can't see it at all at the front here. Well, suppose we're in a situation, moving around, I should stop doing that. Suppose we're in a situation when we feel utterly alone. Perhaps we're going back home today and we're struggling again with the loss of a loved one. The fact that the children have gone and we just still haven't got over it. They've grown up and flown the nest. And we're going back home and we're having lunch on our own. Well, we can take great encouragement in this, that as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. Like a big set of arms surrounding us, the Lord surrounds us like the mountains do in Jerusalem. Suppose we're fearing the future. There's something big that's going to be happening. Perhaps we've got some surgery and we're terrified by surgery. And there we are, we'll be lying down there at some point on our own. Well, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. Perhaps we're on a situation in work where we're the only Christian as far as we know, and it's a pretty hostile environment to be in. And we're not looking forward to Monday morning. Well, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people both now and forevermore. So we're never alone as pilgrim people, because wherever we go in the whole world, Psalm 139, wherever we go, the Lord is surrounding us with his presence and protection and love, delighting to show us mercy just when we need it. This is amazing, isn't it? We're never alone as pilgrims, because the Lord surrounds us safely and securely, giving us the protection that we need. And we're to trust in the Lord's protection. So a few months ago we were burgled, and they only took a laptop. But for some time afterwards I didn't sleep very well. I did various things like, I'd kind of wake up in the middle of the night several times and thinking, what's that noise? Is the security light on? And have the mobile phone next to me ready to call the police, and thinking about what I might do if I kind of got someone downstairs, just kind of shivering in the bed and not wanting to get out from under the duvet. Well, I would have done well to meditate on Psalm 125 verses 1 and 2. It's good to have extra security measures. It's good to have a phone to ring the police and things like that. But the most important thing I missed, and I should have learnt this more quickly, is that the Lord surrounds his people both now and forevermore. The Lord's protection is what we're to trust in wherever we are. It's like we've got this kind of protection shield all around us. So the Lord won't let us be harmed in a way that comes outside his loving and sovereign will. He will protect us. He will look after us with all the things that we fear in the future. And we do well to meditate upon this, and it's the most lovely picture to have in our minds, isn't it? As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. Well, aren't these great psalms? 3 big chunks of bread from heaven for us this morning as pilgrim people. Well, which one do you need to really kind of chew down on this morning? Do you recognize that you need to be getting your posture right in asking for God's mercy rather than you owe me one? Psalm 123. Do you need to see God's deliverance? Psalm 124. Especially these mini deliverances along the way, where it's easy to forget that God has been at work. His fingerprints are all over our lives. Or do you need to drill down on Psalm 125? To trust in God's protection. We're never alone. He surrounds us just like mountains around Jerusalem. And he'll keep doing that all the way until we get to our destination. The life of a pilgrim is hard work. But we're not there yet, are we? As the children cry in the back of the car. There's a glorious and wonderful future awaiting us, where the arms of the Lord that surround us like mountains around Jerusalem will be flung open, like in the parable of the prodigal son, and he will welcome us joyfully into his presence, which is our destination, by his mercy and grace, not because we're anything to speak of, but because he delights to show and shower us with mercy. And what a welcome home we will receive. The best is yet to be. And as John Wesley said about his own people, my people, they die well. And Christians do, don't we? Because that's where we're going. The Lord who protects us is the Lord who will meet us and greet us when we go to be with him. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we come before you recognizing that life as pilgrims is hard, it's lonely, it's tiring. But we thank you for your many deliverances in our lives up to this point. We thank you that as your pilgrim people, already you've delivered us from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of the Son you love. But we also remember this morning all those mini deliverances, those ways where you were at work which we didn't always see or acknowledge. And we praise you for this great hope we have in the future, that wherever we are, whether it's surgery or a lonely lunch, that you surround us as the mountains surround Jerusalem. That your presence, your protection, and your mercy will never leave us until that day when we meet you face to face and you open your arms to greet us with love and affection for all of eternity. We praise you that this is true, not because we are good, but because your Son Jesus died on the cross to pay for all our sin in full there. Amen.